Hey guys, this is Mr. Champlin. Today we're going to be talking about the Cnidarians. So this is our first group of animals that we're going to be talking about. So notice that I said the Cnidarians. So that C is silent. So we're going to see lots of words that begin with C in this particular section. Again, the C is always going to be silent. All right, so the Cnidarians is a phylum. It's the first group or phylum of animals that we're going to talk about. They are invertebrates, and invertebrates, of course, are animals that do not have a vertebrate or a backbone. So things like snails and worms and cnidarians and sponges and all those things, are invertebrates. So I think most of you already know that. So we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about that. Now this particular group, they're very simple animals. In fact, they're the simplest animals to have any kind of symmetry. So in the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about different types of symmetry. But like all their animals, they have specialized tissues, which is to say that they have cells that are layered that kind of work together. And so we'll give some examples of different tissues that we see with these guys. Now they are soft-bodied, as you well know. So things like jellies and things of that sort, they're very soft. They are carnivorous, meaning that they eat meat, and they're not quick animals. They don't move very quickly, as you saw in the video. So how do they catch their prey? Well, they rely on these stinging, tentacles that are sort of arranged around their mouth. And it's a little hard to see in this particular picture here in the background, but the mouth would be somewhere around here. All right, so this is called the bell. This would be where the mouth is, and you can see there are lots of tentacles arranged in a circle around that mouth. Now they do have these stinging tentacles, and that is because they have these things that are called cnidocytes. And these are specialized cells that are that contain stingers. And these stingers actually, when they're touched by anything, a person or a fish or whatever, they'll sort of launch out, and they kind of pop out kind of like a jack-in-the-box. And the thing that pops out and stings you is called the nematocyst. So that's the thing that actually stings you. But again, the nematocyst is found inside the cnidocytes. And whenever you see cyte, you should think cell. It's a type of cell. So these cnidocytes and nematocysts are something that's really special to this particular group of animals. No other animals has this exact thing. So again, symmetry. These are the simplest animals to have any kind of symmetry. So what type of symmetry do they have? Well, they have what's called radial symmetry. And there are two main types of symmetry. There's radial symmetry and bilateral symmetry. And by radial symmetry, I want you to think like a tire. Radial symmetry, it's round. And so when you take the animal or the object and you sort of slice it almost like a pizza, you're going to get basically all the pieces are going to look pretty much the same. Whereas if you took this lobster and you sliced it, in different ways, all the parts would look different. So anything with bilateral symmetry, you can sort of slice down the middle, and the right side and the left side are kind of like mirror images of one another. So a lobster has mirror symmetry. This shovel has mirror symmetry. All right. This pot does not have mirror symmetry. It has radial symmetry. Now, if you have bilateral symmetry, you're going to have a dorsal or a top side. You're going to have a ventral or a stomach side. You're going to have an anterior or a head end, and a posterior or an anus end. So, but if you have radial symmetry, you don't have these, right? You're just kind of the same pretty much all the way around. Now, if you have bilateral symmetry, it means you're also going to probably experience or manifest cephalization. And what is cephalization means? Whenever you see the ceph in front of something, it means head. So this means that animals that exhibit cephalization, they have a head with the centralized nerves in their head region. So lobsters and humans, right, we're great examples of that. We are animals with cephalization. We have a head end. And what's found in that head end? Well, a brain. Of course, a lobster brain is very tiny. And all kinds of sensory organs like eyes and maybe antenna for tasting or smelling. All right, so all of these are kind of focused in the head region or the anterior region of the animal, because this is usually the part of the animal that sort of meets the environment head on. so to speak. All right, so back to the Cnidarians. So again, that C silent, but they have lots of these nematocysts, these stinging sort of darts that can launch out when touched, and they inject venom, which can cause paralyzation. So it's really touch that's going to trigger this, and a single tentacle can have hundreds or thousands of these nematocysts or stinging cells. Now they're used for defense, so obviously if something brushes up against them or tries to eat them, they will sting, but also more importantly for feeding, right? So again, these are very soft-bodied creatures. There's not much to them that you can rip them apart very easily, and so they need to have these stinging cells to make sure that their prey becomes paralyzed and dies very, very quickly. Now, if you've ever been stung by a jellyfish, you know that it is painful, but the chances that you're going to sustain serious injuries or die is almost nil. So it would take a lot of these stinging cells from a jellyfish to actually kill a human, and it rarely happens, although we will talk about one group that is particularly dangerous. Luckily, they live in Australia, so we don't have to worry about them around here. Unfortunately, I could not embed the videos because I have a very old version of PowerPoint, but if you look at this video on YouTube real quick, it's only like 30 seconds or so. Great video, though, that shows you when you under a microscope, when you touch those jellyfish tentacles, these nematocysts shooting out. It happens in just a fraction of a second, injecting venom into whatever touches it. So again, it's kind of showing you here's a tentacle. Here are the nematocysts, these stinging cells, and then inside, I should say, cnidocytes, and inside the cnidocytes are the nematocysts. So here it is, and you can see it's got a trigger. So when it gets touched, when it gets brushed up against that trigger, it's going to launch this, and this basically is kind of all curled up inside, and it comes flying out at lightning speed, and again injects, pierces the skin of the victim and injects venom. Now, of course, each one of these nematocysts contains very little venom. But again, if you are being stung by thousands or tens of thousands, it's going to add up, and it can paralyze or even kill you, especially if you're a small animal like a small fish. The kind of thing that these guys would actually eat. So let's talk a little bit about the basic body plan of the Cnidarians. So as we already mentioned, the Cnidarians have a radial body symmetry. So in other words, they're round. They have a mouth in the middle with tentacles arranged around the mouth. And no matter pretty much how you slice them, each slice will be pretty much the same. Also, we should mention that they have 2 layers of tissue. One of them is called the ectoderm. That's on the outside, so ecto means outside. And the other is called the endoderm, endo meaning inside. Now, we actually have 3 layers of body tissue. We're obviously more sophisticated animals than jellyfish and their relatives. But they only have 2 layers. In the middle of these 2 layers, they have what's called the mesoglia, which is this jelly-like substance. So again, very, very simple animals. They have a layer of cells. They have this layer of sort of jelly, this non-living material, and then another layer of cells on the inside of that. We're also going to talk about the difference between the polyp and the medusa form. And you'll see in the next slide that's shown very clearly. But we should mention that they have what's called a gastrovascular cavity. And this gastrovascular cavity, think of it like a stomach. That's where digestion occurs. And they also have a closed digestive system, which we're going to talk about what that is. All right, so here we see the medusa form right here. So kind of your classic, jellyfish, right? Here's your mouth. Here's your gastrovascular cavity where digestion takes place. Here's the tentacles arranged around the mouth. Here's your polyp form, very similar, but kind of flipped upside down. So instead of the tentacles hanging down, like you see in a jelly, the tentacles are facing up. Here's your mouth. Here's your gastrovascular cavity where digestion is going to take place. Here is an actual picture of some polyps. So this is probably a soft coral or something similar to that. So you see each one of these is a polyp. Here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one. So there's hundreds of little polyps. And you can just barely make out the little tentacles. And of course the mouth would be right in the middle of these little tentacles. So these guys are probably sort of in a place in the ocean where there's pretty rapid currents, and they're grabbing little particles of food from the water. They're filtering it out and bringing it towards their mouths so they can digest it. Now, of course, jellies, classic Medusa form, right? And you have the, bell. Here's your, tentacles. The mouth is in the middle, and the gastrovascular cavity would be inside here. All right, so let's talk more about feeding. How does feeding occur in these animals? Well, as we already mentioned, they get a mouth. They have tentacles, so they'll bring the food into the mouth. And then they have a gastrovascular cavity. And in this gastrovascular cavity, this is where the food will get broken down. Well, notice that there's something missing here. We said they have what's called a closed digestive system. So we, of course, eat food. The food goes in our mouth, and we're done digesting it. Whatever we can't digest just goes out our anus. Well, these guys don't have an anus. So how does that work? Well, after they have digested their food, what they're going to do is they're going to then expel it back out through the mouth. So their mouth kind of acts like a mouth and an anus. So we call that a closed digestive system, or an incomplete digestive tract. So no anus. And we should also mention, how do they sort of get through life? They obviously have some kind of digestive system, but, how do they breathe? How do all these other things happen? Well, respiration, or the exchange of CO2 and oxygen, circulation, or sort of the movement of oxygen and nutrients throughout their body, and excretion, getting rid of stuff, all happens by diffusion. So they're very simple animals. They have sort of a digestive system, so to speak, but they don't really have gills or lungs or anything to help them breathe. They don't have blood or arteries and veins to help move things around, and they don't have kidneys or a urinary bladder to take care of that kind of stuff. So all that stuff just kind of moves around by diffusion, this sort of random motion of molecules from higher concentration to lower concentration. So this works, okay, because they're slow-moving animals. They're very simple. Many of them are very small, so this diffusion works. This wouldn't work for us because we are much larger. We sort of live life much, more quickly. So we need specialized organs and body systems to take care of all that stuff. But these guys, really simple. In fact, they're so simple, they do not have a brain. So how does that work? Well, remember we talked about, cephalization. So cephalization, this whole idea of you have a head end with a brain of some sort. It could be small, it could be large, but you have a brain. And then you have all kinds of sensory organs, like maybe some eyes, and other sensory organs for smell and touch. But these guys are built differently. Remember, they don't have a head end, so they don't have a front and a back like we do. So they don't really need a brain. What they have instead is what's called a nerve net. All right, here they've actually injected some dye into it, and you can see it here in blue. So think of it like the internet. It's not centralized. So you can't sneak up on these guys because they don't have, behind. There's no front and back. They see the world in sort of 360. They sense the world in 360. So most of these guys don't have eyes, but they probably have some light sensitive cells, and of course they're sensitive to touch and smell and other things. But they sort of process all of this without a brain. They don't need a brain. Instead, they have this nerve net. Movement. So how do they get around? Well, they don't have a skeleton like you and I have. They don't have, bones or anything. They're very, very soft. But they do have what's called the hydrostatic skeleton. Now, this name is a little bit misleading because it's not really a skeleton. Hydro refers to water. All right, so basically, the water, both inside them and outside, kind of gives them their shape. And you know that if you take a jellyfish out of water, what does it look like? It just kind of looks like a pile of jelly. It doesn't really have any shape to it. So they call it a hydrostatic skeleton, but again, it's just this sort of water pressure that's inside the organism that kind of gives it its shape. What they do have, though, is they do have two sets of muscles. They have these circular muscles, which kind of, well, they're found in circles, and then these longitudinal muscles, which are sort of lengthwise. And what this does is it gives the animal the ability to sort of shorten itself and to contract in a sort of circular fashion. So you've all, of course, seen how jellies move throughout the water, and they kind of take the bell, which is this structure here, and it kind of contracts and, causes this sort of jet propulsion thing. Now, of course, even though they do have muscles and they do move, they're not really strong swimmers. They don't really move all that well. So they can kind of move towards or away from things, but if something's chasing after them to eat them, it's not like they're going to escape, but they can move around. When they're in nature, a lot of what's moving them around also would be the wind or the ocean currents and all that. So they kind of have to work with the wind and the ocean currents. They don't do a good job of sort of fighting those things. They're just really not strong swimmers. But they can move some, and they do have muscles. Reproduction. So I think the video that you guys saw the other day really showed it really well. And like many simple animals, they have both asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. Now, of course, in humans, we can't reproduce asexually. We can't make clones of ourselves. But many simple animals can. And so for asexual reproduction, what happens is oftentimes budding occurs, which is to say that a little sort of mini version will kind of start growing off the side of the polyp, and then it can break off and sort of form its own animal. So I always tell students, it's kind of like if you had a mini-me kind of growing out your side, and once that mini-me reached a certain size, it would just kind of, jump off and start, living its own life. As far as sexual reproduction goes, as with all animals, they produce eggs and sperm. But unlike many of the animals that you are familiar with, they live in water, and so they would have external fertilization, which is to say that some of them would release sperm into the water, some of them would release eggs into the water, and sort of the sperm might fertilize the egg and produce the next generation, but a lot is kind of left to chance. Once it is fertilized, it will form what's called a planula larva, and this larva is this little thing that can kind of swim around a little bit, and then it will find probably a good spot, and it will kind of settle down and turn into whatever it's going to be, jellyfish or something else. So again, I think they did a really good job of showing you in the movie of sort of how this works. So this planula larva will find a good spot. It'll settle down and grow into a polyp, and then you see it kind of has all these like sort of layers on this polyp, and then what happens eventually is these sort of layers will kind of pop off and will kind of form into a medusa form. So many of these, although not all of them, have both a medusa form and a polyp form in their life cycle. But we're going to talk about the different groups next time, and you'll see that some only have the medusa form, some only have the polyp form, and some have both.